my privilege to introduce this morning our three honored guests. Our first speaker will be Dr. Hugh Hunt. He will be presenting on Edith Stein's letters to Roman Ingarden, which he considers to be a model of friendship. In 1979, Dr. Hunt received a PhD in philosophy and religion at Emory University. He spent his academic career at Kennesaw State University, 25 years in the classroom, and 5 years in administration in the Dean's Office in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. He has also led study abroad groups to Germany and Poland. Initially, Dr. Hunt's area of academic interest was late 19th century German philosophy. But after meeting Edith Stein's niece, a colleague in the nursing department at Kennesaw State University, and learning about the life and thought of her aunt, his interest shifted to phenomenology in general, Edith Stein's philosophy in particular. Later, he encountered the correspondence of Edith Stein and Roman Ingarden, a Polish phenomenologist. Soon after retirement, he devoted himself to the translation from German to English of the 162 letters Stein wrote to Ingarden. Dr. Hunt is under contract with ICS Publications to complete the translation early this year, and it should appear later in the year as a volume in the collected works of Edith Stein. Our second panelist is Mr. Michael Bradley, who will be speaking on erotic love, what it is and what it is not. Michael Bradley is a senior studying philosophy and theology at the University of Notre Dame. He is editor-in-chief of Notre Dame's independent Catholic student newspaper, Rover, managing editor of Etica Politica, the online journal of the Center for Morality and Public Life, and a regular contributor to the Intercollegiate Review. This year, he is also an Intercollegiate Studies Institute Honors Fellow and a Fellow for the Tocqueville Program for Inquiry into Religion and American Public Life. Our final panelist, Robert G. Elliot, will be speaking on the gratuity of love. Converting from a resentful atheism to Christianity when he was 20 years old, Mr. Elliot's faith has driven him to reconsider the nature of his relationships with others and to develop constructive and flourishing relationships in the light of Christ's love for us. The Templeton Honors College of Eastern University, a small liberal arts college just outside of Philadelphia, has provided him with a comprehensive education in a Great Works program, and with charitable, wise, and courageous professors. As a senior, he is in the hazy midst of applying for graduate schools in philosophy and theology, with the hope of doing research at the intersection of 20th century continental philosophy and theology. Dr. Hunt will go first, but please first join me in welcoming our three panelists.
Good morning. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I understand there are some mechanical problems, no images, but that's okay. Well, I'm honored and excited to make the presentation this morning, but I never dreamed when I submitted the proposal that I'd be presented in this way. I must say I feel more than 6 degrees of separation, but that's okay. Thanks to modern technology, at least my voice can be transmitted. Excuse me. All right, my presentation, Edith Stein's letters to Roman Ingarden, model for friendship. First, just something about the name. I'm going to use the English Edith Stein, although Edith Stein is the precise German pronunciation, but every time I think Edith Stein or Edith Stein, I think of one of the last letters that she wrote to Roman Ingarden, in which she said, quoting, "It is now 3 weeks since the funeral bell rang for Edith Stein. She is now Sister Teresa Benedicta of the Cross." And then, in the next to last letter she wrote to Roman Ingarden, she asked him, "Do you think you could call me Sister Benedicta? I am now accustomed to that name, whereas with the name Miss Stein," which is the way he always addressed his letters to her, "I have to ask myself, what kind of thing is that?" Interesting. But I'm going to use Edith Stein. Just a little background. In my presentation, I relate two themes: the writings of Edith Stein and authentic friendship. For the writings, I focus on her letters to Roman and Garden. And for authentic friendship, I look at two views on the subject in the Western philosophical tradition. I want to show how the letters provide, as I noted in the title of my presentation, a model for friendship, one that fits squarely in the Western tradition of friendship, one that offers a concrete, realistic example of authentic friendship. I planned a short biographical introduction for both Edith Stein and Roman Ingarden, but I think I will abbreviate my introduction to Edith Stein, assuming that most everyone present has a good working knowledge of her life. But I will say a few words about Roman Ingarden because I assume precisely the opposite for him. Nevertheless, and I also want to introduce him because even in the biographical sketch I'm going to give, there are a couple of clues about her friendship, her understanding of friendship. Roman Ingarden was born in Krakow in 1893, received a doctorate in philosophy in Freiburg in 1918 with a dissertation on Henri Bergson, and here's my first hint about her friendship. She made significant contributions to the final editing, both for language and grammar, and proofing of his dissertation. He returned to Poland, his home, and received a university appointment, first at Limburg in 1925, then at Krakow in 1945. Among his many academic contributions, he brought phenomenology to Poland and to the discipline of aesthetics with his major work, The Literary Work of Art. And here's my second comment about her contribution to her understanding of friendship. She made extensive revisions, corrections, modifications, both by way of proving and editing the final version of this major work on the phenomenology and aesthetics. Nevertheless, the letters. Edith Stein and Roman Ingarden met in 1913 in Göttingen, where they were studying phenomenology with Edmund Husserl. They followed him to Freiburg in 1916. Ingarden returned to Krakow in 1917, and their correspondence began. He was back in Freiburg in 1917 late 1917, excuse me, to complete the exams for his doctoral degree. And then in early 1918, returned to Krakow. Over the next 2 decades, they met twice, but only twice, very briefly each time. But between 17 and 38, they corresponded frequently. Fortunately, Ingarden saved all of the letters and postcards from Edith Stein. After his death, his sons gave the originals to the Academy of Science in Warsaw, and just prior to Edith Stein's beatification in 1987, presented copies to the Edith Stein Archive in Cologne. There are 162 letters and postcards, and they are published in Edith Stein Gesamtausgabe 4, Volume 4. Unfortunately, all of Ingarden's letters to Stein are missing. And a brief comment here. I've been in touch with Ingarden's grandson, who is the executor of the literary estate, and he is of the opinion that Edith Stein never returned the letters. Ingarden requested that she return the letters, and there are indications in the letter she wrote that she was about to send them back, she was trying to send them back, but his son-in-law thinks she never did because he said his grandfather saved every scrap of paper having to do with anything about his life. So I'm curious where the letters are. Maybe someday an archivist will discover them. These letters are important for many reasons. Principal reason being that, as Dr. Gail Falkovitz points out in their introduction to the volume of letters, they close the gap in the earlier volumes of her letters, especially the time just before and after her conversion. when half the letters are from 1917 to 1922. They're important for another reason. In these letters, Edith Stein is more open and candid with Roman Ingarden than she ever was with anyone else, even with her family members. And there's an interesting, somewhat comical comment she made to him about the letter she wrote. She said, paraphrasing, "Don't you ever think about publishing these letters, because everyone who knows me would think they are forgeries." Well, actually, he did publish little excerpts from the letters later, but that's another matter. Edith Stein's letters to Roman Ingarden reveals someone searching for the truth in practically every aspect of life, among them politics, rights of women, meaning in history, Christianity, self-identity, and of course, though never explicitly addressed, friendship. With Ingarden in particular, but I think it's safe to say friendship in general. The letters offer a detailed picture of Edith Stein as she matures intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. I could offer dozens of fascinating examples in each category, but I want to focus on her understanding of friendship. First, some background on the Western philosophical tradition. The Western philosophical tradition is rich with literature on friendship. A few examples: Plato's Lysis, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, numerous works by the Stoics, Augustine's Confessions, Thomas Aquinas' Summa, Montaigne's Essays, Kant's Lecture on Friendship, and I could go on and on. In addition, there are many examples from the contemporary period and many sets of correspondence between friends. And to my mind, the set coming closest to the Stein-Ingarden correspondence is between friends, the correspondence of Hannah Arendt and Mary McCarthy. I would like to present two perspectives on friendship that offer clear, concise definitions. Definitions that, in fact, form the basis for many of the other treatments of friendship in the Western tradition. I refer to Aristotle's treatment of friendship in Nicomachean Ethics and Kant's lecture on friendship in his lectures on ethics. Aristotle was not at all satisfied with Plato's attempt to define friendship. Thus, he addressed friendship directly and sought to define it on the basis of what friendship entails and how true friends relate to one another. He examined and quickly rejected all notions of friendship based on utility, noting that if friendship were based on utility, when the utility ceased, the friendship would probably cease. The same for friendship based on pleasure. Aristotle was not interested in the kind of friendship that lasts for a brief time. Rather, he sought the nature of friendship that lasts for a lifetime. For Aristotle, quoting, "Perfect friendship is the friendship of people who are good and alike in virtue. Well, they are alike in wishing each other's good. Those who wish the good for their friends and for their friends' sake, keyword, are in the truest sense friends. Their friendship is permanent." Immanuel Kant addressed friendship within the context of practical, not theoretical philosophy. He viewed it as an ethical idea, a necessary ethical idea, a moral virtue, that is, to quote, "not of heaven but of earth." He examined friendship by addressing the tension in humans between love of self and love of the other. He sought the idea of friendship by focusing on the ideal friendship with the other, acknowledging, of course, that such was not a human possibility. Ideal friendship, that is. Considering three types of friendship, those based on need, taste, and disposition, he concluded that authentic friendship is based solely on the latter, because the first two necessarily involve some kind of utility, to use Aristotle's term, and by definition, cannot be genuine or permanent. Authentic friendship for Kant was friendship of, to quote, pure, genuine disposition. Kant went on to say there was no German wording that captured all of that, nevertheless. The friendship of disposition is friendship in the absolute sense. As noted, Edith Stein did not specifically address the nature and meaning of friendship. However, an examination of her letters to Roman and Garden reveal a clear picture of what she thinks about friendship. Some facts from the letters. In the letters, Edith Stein often uses the word friend and friendship. I will cite some examples from the 162 letters and postcards. She writes, "Dearest friend, dear friend, to my friend, from your faithful friend, and if I know my friend, preserve your friendship with me. My friendship with you remains unchanged, based on our long friendship. Because of our friendship, we have a genuine friendship, and I do not need to prove my friendship." Now, those are usages of friend and friendship from the 162 letters. The most interesting, though it does not involve the word friend, is when on December the 24th, 1917, just after Engarden left Freiburg, she begins a letter with "Mein Liebling," and throughout the letter uses the familiar "du," "dir," "dich," and so forth, by the way, for the one and only time in the entire set of correspondence. Evidently, Engarden did not react favorably to the letter, because in the next letter she noted that based on his reaction, she really did not want to write anymore. But even in this letter, she goes on to say that she will answer his questions about phenomenology, about Husserl, and so forth. And I think her reaction is telling, and from the outset indicative of her understanding of friendship. In spite of being rebuffed, she tells him that she is his friend and she will stand by him, support him, engage with him, even though clearly she saw the handwriting on the wall with reference to something more than friendship. She maintains the position throughout the correspondence, even after Engarden's surprise announcement of his marriage in 1921, even after many disagreements about metaphysics, Christianity, and a host of other subjects, and even after some hostility expressed by Engarden in a host of the other areas. Edith Stein assures him of her friendship. I'm almost finished. Edith Stein had so many reasons not to be Engarden's friend, not to maintain the friendship, and I could cite some examples, but I will not for time's sake. However, she never wavered in her loyalty to Engarden. In fact, by 1922, the year of her conversion, she had found her center and had regained her self-confidence. Frequently, she reminds Engarden of this newly discovered sense of self and of her friendship, and I suggest by doing so that she clearly demonstrates her understanding of genuine friendship. I suggest that any thought of utility was completely foreign to her mind. For the remaining years of their correspondence, she consistently maintained authentic friendship with her Polish colleague. Edith Stein thought of her friendship as permanent. I think the letters to Roman and Garden are a beautiful example of someone acting totally and exclusively for her friend's sake, in quotes. And remembering Kant's comments about ideal friendship, to be sure she withheld some thoughts and feelings, especially about her newly found center in Christianity, when it became apparent that there was no possibility of reaching agreement with Engarden. Still, she continued to be friends with him, and I suggest he was with her. Another perfect example of acting for the sake of her friend. In conclusion, I suggest that Edith Stein's letters to Roman and Garden are an excellent example of authentic friendship. Edith Stein never specifically addressed the subject of friendship, but she did not have to. She lived it. Questions? Oh, at the end. Okay, great. Okay.
Since he can't hear the applause, we'll move on to Mr. Bradley.
So I want to begin by thanking the organizers of the conference for inviting us here this weekend, and especially for allowing me the opportunity to present. I joked with Rob beforehand that you know who your real friends are when, on 9 a.m. on a freezing Saturday morning, people climb out of bed to come over to listen to talks about love. So thank you all for being here. It's really great to see you. As you'll see in the abstract, I'm talking about erotic love today, what it is and what it isn't. And I think that what makes this a timely topic for this conference on relationships and the call to love can be illustrated well by a short anecdote involving my own sister, which I did not tell her about beforehand, so I hope she's not too embarrassed. The other day I was at home preparing the house for some guests who are staying there this weekend for the conference, and my mom pulled me aside and said sort of quietly, "You know, Michael, your sister came over to me and asked the other day, in a sort of nervous tone, 'Mom, what does Michael know about erotic love?'" And I think that illustrates well a conception or a concept I really want to sort of go out here today, which is, if I say erotic, most of you probably think sexual. And that's probably the first connotation, the first association that comes to your mind. For good reason. You think of erotic imagery or erotic literature, 50 Shades of Grey and all that jazz. But what I want to talk about today primarily is how, if we recover the Western tradition's understanding of erotic love and eros and what it is and what it isn't, it might actually help us to understand better what one of last night's speakers called the anthropological crisis that we're in today, which is sort of the occasion of the conference itself. So I'm going to talk about the relationship between erotic love to sexual love, to agape, or caritas, Christian love, so to speak. I can't hope to do this topic justice in 15 minutes, so my hope is to just sort of maybe open a new avenue of thought, and you guys can follow up on this, read some great books about it later. So, to begin with, we have to define erotic love. What are we talking about when we speak of erotic love? And before we can do that, we have to have somewhat of a working definition for love itself more generally. Now, as soon as one poses that question, the problem becomes very clear that there's a great disparity between how we tend to use the word love. And Pope Benedict XVI illustrates this very well at the very, very beginning of his 2006 encyclical Deus Caritas Est, where he points out, we speak of love of wine, love of food, love of music, love of dancing, love of women, love of friends, parents, etc., etc., etc. And so one can fairly ask the question, when we speak of love at all, is there any unifying core that we're referring to? Or is it really fair even to use this one word to cover so many different meanings and concepts? Now, Joseph Pieper, who's a 20th century German Thomist, Catholic philosopher, whom Benedict once called one of his 3 greatest intellectual influences, wrote a beautiful, beautiful essay on love in 1974. And I'm basically going to be exposing Pieper's views here on that question about the nature of love and erotic love specifically. So if anything I say is remotely meaningful to you, go check out this book, Joseph Pieper on Love. It's fantastic. It'll change your life, to be cliche. But following Plato and following others in the tradition who had approached the topic of erotic love, including C.S. Lewis, who wrote about this very famously in his 1954 book, The Four Loves, this is how Pieper defines erotic love. He says, quote, "We mean by eros the desire for full existence, for existential exaltation, for happiness and for bliss. A desire that cannot be diverted or invalidated, and that naturally dominates and permeates all our emotions, all of our conscious decisions, and above all, our love for the world and for other human beings." And C.S. Lewis, as a parallel text, says in The Four Loves, eros is the characteristic need love. So it's a love that comes out of a place of fundamental incompleteness, a love that comes out of a place of needing completion in the beloved. So there's that to work with. Pieper, as a Thomist, is always following St. Thomas Aquinas, and we find in Thomas a couple of quotes that pick this up very well. Thomas says, "Man desires happiness naturally and by necessity." He says, "To desire to be happy is not a matter of free choice." He says, "Happiness can virtually be defined as the epitome of all those things that the will is incapable of not willing." It's a lot of negatives there, but try to tease that out a little bit. So eros, for Thomas, for Augustine, for many thinkers in the tradition, is the cornerstone of all of our loves. Any love that we have, be it caritas or any other form of love, is built upon the cornerstone of eros. And erotic desire is basically the desire for fulfillment and completion in the other. It's a recognition that we're incomplete as who we are. This sort of language would be familiar to John Paul II buffs. He talks a lot about this in Theology of the Body. albeit in slightly different language, but you should be familiar with this probably from Catholic theology or Christian theology. Excuse me. So, Pieper then goes on to define love more generally and says, in all of the usages of love, including erotic love, when you say that you love somebody, so I'm speaking only of relational love here, not love of wine or love of music, or all those good things, you're basically affirming the goodness of the beloved. You're not just wishing good for the beloved, you're not just saying, I hope that good things happen to you, I hope you get that job promotion, I hope your friends come to watch you at 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning. But you're saying, no, it's good that you exist. In your very essence, you are good, and it's because of that essential goodness that you wish the good upon them. So Pieper says, along with Thomas, that love is basically an affirmation or a confirmation of the goodness of the beloved, which of course implies that the beloved really is good. You know, Pieper also says, lovability always precedes love, and Ratzinger says the same thing. And so the idea here is that in order for our affirmation of the beloved to be anything but an illusion or a sham or a sort of a mirage, I know Schopenhauer calls it the trick of nature in his own pessimism. In order for that not to be the case, when we affirm the goodness of the beloved, it has to be the case that the beloved really is good at an essential level, obviously. Then the question becomes, okay, well, in what can we root that sort of essential goodness? And as I hint at in my abstract, the answer there is the doctrine of creation. And so really the cornerstone here of understanding erotic love is creation. And that's why I think it'd be more fruitful when one hears erotic or hears the word eros, think of creation, not sex or sexuality, and you'll be starting off on a much better path to understanding what this is and what it's supposed to mean. I'm writing my thesis on the doctrine of creation, so hopefully what I'm saying is either true or interesting to you all, because if it's not, I'm in trouble for the next couple of months here. So, we've arrived at the heart of love here, which is creation itself, and many of you have probably already drawn the connection here between the affirmation of the beloved that we make in saying, you are good, it's good that you exist, and a very familiar phrase that we've heard in the book of Genesis. So God, the Lord, the creator of all visible and invisible, heaven and earth, is not just the prime mover of Aristotle and of the philosophers, but he's the first lover in Christian faith. And in Genesis, God makes his creation, he creates, and the first thing he says, it is good. And for Pieper and for the whole tradition, that really becomes the cornerstone of understanding erotic love and understanding all of our loves in two senses. In the first sense, there is this existential goodness. We have this essential existential goodness to us. But in the second sense, as creatures also, and Pieper really tries to hammer home this point, it's not just that we are good, but we're filled with a desire to affirm the good in others. So as Pieper puts it, it's not just that we're lovable, although we are, and it's not just that we need love, although we do, but we're constituted to love to love. We love to love others. And that, he says, is an imprint of the divine, the Trinitarian life. That is itself love. As John says, God is love. Capital L there. So Pieper really is trying to tie this concept into creation. And we begin to think of ourselves as creatures, not just as beings, people who exist and have substance, but as creatures. And therefore, as creatures, precisely, we're incomplete. And because we're creatures, ultimately, we're only going to find the source, or we're going to find the satisfaction of our happiness, the satisfaction of our erotic longing for fulfillment and for desire, in the source of that same desire. The source and the satisfaction is the same person, the same persons, it's the Godhead. And to you Augustine fans out there, this will sound familiar when you say that we're created such that we will be restlessly searching, erotically searching for communion and union and unity with God until we find that union. Of course, that's the famous dictum from the Confessions that you see quoted. It's probably the most quoted, Christian bloggy thing you can see out there. You just see it written everywhere. But that's really what I'm going for here. This may seem obvious to us, many of us here are Catholic, but the relationship between eros and Christian love has actually been very highly contested in theology, in Christian theology, mostly by Protestant thinkers. Luther very famously took that dictum of Augustine and said that it represented the epitome of what's dangerous about Augustine's Platonic doctrines of eros. Luther was not a fan. One of Luther's heirs is a 20th century Swiss theologian named Anders Nygren. Correct me if I'm wrong on pronouncing that, but that's how his name looks on paper and on Wikipedia. But Nygren basically posits this fundamental antithesis between the erotic love that we speak of when we think of creation, the first creation, and the love of the second creation, the recreation through Christ. And what he wants to say, and he does say this explicitly, referencing Marcion, who is a 2nd century heretic, FYI, that creation has nothing to do with redemption. And this is his main point, and this is a very Protestant point. Creation has nothing to do with redemption. And he's drawing on Luther there as well. And because creation has nothing to do with redemption, eros, or the love that we have by virtue of our being creatures, created, our human essence and nature, has nothing to do with the caritas that God infuses us with. It has nothing to do with the grace that we're offered through Christ and through God. And so there's this separation between who we are as creatures of the first creation and who we're invited to be as creatures of the second creation. Now, the Catholic tradition is going to push back against this very powerfully. Thomas does, of course, as well. And the question becomes, how are we to understand this balance? Because on the one hand, it seems apparent to us, it ought to seem apparent to us that we can't, as Thomas pointed out, St. Thomas, you can't obviate your desire for fulfillment, this existential longing for happiness. You can't get around that, nor should you want to. And yet, on the other hand, we have these New Testament sayings. In order to find yourself, you have to lose yourself. You are to give and not to count the cost. The greatest thing man can do is lay down his life for his friends. That doesn't sound like the sort of eros, the needy, gathering into myself, I need you to complete me, I need you sort of love. There seems to be an antithesis here. And the question becomes, how are we to make sense of the relationship between eros and agape? Now, one thing that also becomes apparent there when you sort of bring up those sayings of Christ and whatnot, and Ratzinger points this out, is that the relationship between eros and agape, the idea that there's an antithesis is fueled by the fact that the Old Testament only uses eros, the word eros, the Greek word, twice, and the New Testament doesn't use the word eros at all. It prefers to use philia, or mostly agape, which becomes caritas in the Latin, charity, the supernatural virtue. So when Benedict points this out in Deus Caritas Est, there seems to be this disconnect here. And maybe there is, or not. The point here that Pieper goes at, following Lewis, is that affirmation of it's good that you exist, it's good that you are, we apply that affirmation first and foremost, as soon as we're conscious, to ourselves. And so if it seems impalatable, if that seems hard to wrap your mind around, Lewis points out, I couldn't make sense of the saying, love the sinner, hate the sin, until I realized that that's how I feel about me all my life. And there's something to that. And so there's this reflexive quality of eros that becomes the cornerstone of how we relate to other people. Now, Pieper will go on to say that in real love, in erotic love, a desire for communion in the other, that is indeed love. When it comes into contact with the injunction to love others without counting the cost, there's a sort of transformation here. But it's a transformation that's possible because there's a fundamental unity to these two loves. There's not this irredeemable antithesis between them. Because if there is, if Luther and the Swiss theologian are correct, I've already forgotten how to pronounce his last name, if they're correct, then there is no relationship between creation and between redemption. But if that's the case, what does that say about our human nature? And it seems very irreconcilable with the basic affirmation that God gives us in Genesis. It is good. It is good that you exist. And we can only turn and say that to other people if God has said that to us first. So we can see the problems in some ways that this strain of Protestant theology poses for the doctrine of creation, for its meaningfulness and for what it can possibly mean for us. In order for love not to be a sham, there has to be that fundamental goodness, as I pointed out earlier, at the core of who we are. So we really need to salvage that. Again, Pieper drives this home eloquently when he says, in his book on love, we are not in the least nothing. Rather, we are creatura, it's Latin, and thereby have an existence that is our own. God-given, certainly, but for that very same reason given to us to be truly our own. And at the same time, man, because of his same creatureliness, is by nature a totally needful being. He's one vast need. But, as I pointed out, but then we also have this saying in the gospel that seems to confirm the fact that eros is the cornerstone of all love, when we're enjoined to love our neighbor as ourselves. So even in the scripture, our reflexive love becomes sort of the paradigm for all love. You have to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And there, when it says love yourself, it's not referring to a selfish love or love that you need to purify, but self-love is the highest form of all love. St. Thomas says this, the tradition says this, self-love is the highest form of love, which can shock some of us and maybe seems not quite right in light of what we're hearing. But we have to remember, our love is fundamentally different than God's love. And I can't really go further on this point much, but you can go read Deus Caritas Est. But it's just important to keep in mind that as creatures we're incomplete, and we need God's love. And so there's this unity between Eros and Agape that we have to sort of go for. Now I know I'm really short on time, and later on, or after, in questions, or perhaps afterwards, we can talk more about the relationship between Eros and what Lewis calls Venus, sexual love. But that relationship is honestly much, much less important than understanding Eros in terms of our creation, and understanding the way in which it's fundamentally compatible with Agape. So, thank you for listening.
I'd like to thank you all for coming out in the freezing cold weather to sit in the freezing cold room and listen to us speak. I'll be presenting on the gratuity of love, and I'll be examining two philosophers from the 20th century. Both are writing at the time of World War II and a little bit after. One is a hardcore atheist philosopher who is, has a really militant philosophy against the church. And the other is a Catholic existential philosopher named Gabriel Marcel. Both are actually really close friends, but intellectual rivals as well. Both are playwrights and would attend each other's plays and would sit halfway through the play and then storm out. And this was a big thing in France. This was actually a really, these two thinkers were really popular, and they were kind of setting the trends in France. So let's get into their thought a little bit. So Sartre divides all of reality into two categories, being in itself and being for itself. Being in itself has identity, fixity, and passivity. This table, for example, is being in itself. It is a thing, or as Sartre would say, an object. Being in itself is also determined within a causal series of natural laws. Gravity, for example, would cause this table to fall if it were dropped from the ceiling. Being for itself, on the other hand, lacks identity. It is fluid and always in flux. For Sartre, consciousness is for itself, since it is undetermined. It is not bound by any laws, but it absolutely transcends them. It can fix its own identity and fix the identity of others. That is, unlike this table, consciousness is free to determine itself. The rest of Sartre's philosophy, including his descriptions of our relationships with others, stands on this fundamental division of the in itself and the for itself. It is best to describe our relationships with others by beginning with a description of an unpeopled environment. When we look out into the world from a park bench, for example, we see trees, birds, a pond, and a footpath. The trees might be further than the pond, the birds might be higher than the footpath, but the tree is only further than the pond and the bird higher than the footpath, only from our perspective on the bench. The entire environment, in a sense, is sucked into our consciousness from our own perspective. We stand at the center of our environment, incorporating and assimilating it into the structure of our own consciousness. Now suppose that a man walks along the footpath within our line of sight. In one sense, we perceive the man in the same way that we perceive the tree. He may be closer than the pond and lower than the bird, but Sartre contends that our perception of the man, in another sense, is fundamentally different from our perception of the environment. For the man is another center of reality. The bird and the tree, even the bench we sit on, now stand in relation to his consciousness. He is at the center of his environment, as a whole in the universe towards which things are flowing. No longer do we alone possess the center of reality. This man does as well. The man then turns towards us, looks at us, and in effect objectifies us. He perceives us like any other object in the world, just like he would perceive the tree or the bird. He sees us sitting at a certain distance from him and a certain distance from the pond. Perhaps we're even sitting on the exact bench that he wanted to sit on, thus revealing ourselves as a nuisance to them. In other words, in looking at us, the man assimilates us into his consciousness, and attaches meaning and value to our existence. The man perceives us as an object, as an in itself, that is located within his environment. This means, however, that the man perceives us in a way that we cannot perceive ourselves. He perceives us from within his own world, within his own consciousness, with its own concerns, with its own projects, and there perceives us in a way that escapes us. We have no access to this man's interpretation of our being. He posits our being, but what he posits is beyond our reach. Perceiving the man, then, is different from perceiving an object, for the object has a fixed identity, while the man fixes identity. A mere object, such as this table, cannot objectify us. However, this man transcends us, as he would say. He fixes our identity and objectifies us. He is therefore a co-present and a rival freedom in this situation. Sartre says, I am no longer master of the situation. Or more exactly, I remain master of it, but it has one real dimension by which it escapes me, by which unforeseen reversals cause it to be otherwise than it appears to me. The man introduces a new and catastrophic aspect to our world. No longer are we masters of our environment, the shapers of the world. This man is another world shaper, and we are just one object amongst other objects in his world. In his freedom, this man determines our being. Relations with the other, however, never remain static. This man does not always stand over and against us. Rather, we can escape his objectifying eye in one of two ways. First, we can return the look and objectify him. And second, we can try to possess him so that he serves us. Each of these possibilities represents a distinct response to the look of the other, and each represents a method by which we can transcend him. Nevertheless, Sartre is clear that each of these methods inevitably fails in the end, and that the tension between us and this man never ceases. We and the other chase after each other, round and round in a vicious circle, like horses on a roundabout. In other words, even when it seems that we have fully mastered the other, or when it seems that the other has mastered us, there is always the possibility that the roles of subject and object will be reversed. Therefore, these descriptions of how we break free from the other must always remain within the context of unending antagonistic relationship between us and the other. Sartre writes, while I attempt to free myself from the hold of the other is trying to free himself from mine. While I seek to enslave the other seeks to enslave me. We are by no means dealing with unilateral relations as an object in itself, but with reciprocal and moving relations. Conflict is the original meaning of our relationships. Either we are trying to transcend the other and objectify him, or he is trying to objectify us. It gets a little lighter. It's not so dark the entire time, I promise. We can break free from the look of the other by indifferently returning the look and objectifying him. Indifference is a rejection of or a blindness to the other's freedom. To be indifferent to the other is to treat him as a thing. In indifference, I scarcely notice others. I act as if I were alone in the world. I brush against people as I brush against the wall. I avoid them as I avoid obstacles. When indifferent, we do not recognize the other's freedom. We treat him as if he were not a subject, as if he were not able to transcend us. But indifference is always characterized by uneasiness. For although we attempt to negate the other's freedom, his freedom will eventually rise up and reveal itself again, even if only in flashes. Indifference, Sartre writes, can be extended with relapses over several years, over our whole life. There are men who die without, save for brief and terrifying flashes of illumination, have ever suspected what the other is. Even just one brief and terrifying flash of illumination, however, is evidence of the other's freedom, and this evidence flies in the face of our cold indifference towards the other. In this brief and terrifying flash, the other is revealed to us as he is in himself, not as a thing, but as freedom. Sartre's description of indifference is rather straightforward. His description of love, however, is a little harder to pin down. Love also tries to escape the objectifying eye of the other, but not by ignoring it. Instead, love seeks to possess the other's freedom so that he serves us. Sartre thinks that when I try to win the love of the other, I recognize his freedom, but strive to structure his consciousness so that he perceives me not as an object amongst other objects, but as the meaning and ultimate end of his world. When he, this other, loves me, I am no longer seen as a this among other thises, but the world is revealed in terms of me. This other then interprets the world and every object in it, always with regard to me and my circumstances. I thus become his absolute center of reference around which all the instrumental things of the world are ordered as pure means. This man's look towards me is not one of objectification, but of fascination and adoration. Sartre argues that love is destined to degenerate into indifference, masochism, hate, or any other negative disposition towards the beloved. Love cannot last because the other is unsatisfied in his love. To him, His love always seems to be one-sided. The beloved almost never equally reciprocates his love. The lover therefore attempts to win the love of the beloved, and he does this by becoming an object of fascination for the beloved. He treats himself as if he were an object, that is, he degrades himself just to draw love from the other. However, to the extent that his love goes unrequited, the lover becomes indifferent or even hostile towards the beloved. His love necessarily degenerates. Sartre says that love cannot last, and his attitude towards this is not absolute horror, but cold, matter-of-fact realism. For Sartre, this is just how relationships work. Gabriel Marcel, however, highlights the tragic element in Sartre's descriptions of our relations, and indicates that Sartre's description of love cannot be comprehensive, that Sartre has severely misunderstood the nature of this phenomenon. Before describing what Sartre has misunderstood, however, we should note that Sartre cannot be entirely wrong. Many of us have witnessed forms of unrequited love in which the lover grew cold or even hostile towards the beloved. And many of us have also witnessed forms of obsessive, self-degrading love in which the lover grew cold or hostile towards himself. Therefore, Sartre's description is still true to experience, but only true when sin reigns, when love has become tainted and corrupted, when love has become not love. Gabriel Marcel, therefore, does not reject Sartre's descriptions wholesale, but rather describes what Sartre has missed, those times in which love does not just degenerate, but is sustained as unconditional love. Unconditional love, however, never remains a fixed state in which we can grow complacent and self-satisfied. We must always be working to love unconditionally, and we also always must strive to remain open and receptive towards those who love us unconditionally. Unconditional love looks radically different from Sartre's notion of love. And the most glaring difference is that unconditional love does not and cannot make the beloved the world center around which everything else orbits. If it did, the lover would become unstable in his love, for though he makes the beloved the center of his world, the beloved does not necessarily have to reciprocate. The lover would then become unsatisfied in this unequal relationship, and would strive to either appropriate, ignore, or win over the beloved. Sartre is right about that. Unconditional love, therefore, prevents the other from becoming the center of the world, and it does this through what Marcel calls communion. For Marcel, unconditional love cannot be described solely in terms of you and me, in terms of two independent and autonomous subjects, but must also be described in terms of the we subject, which is the unity of you and me in communion. Here, neither the self or the other is placed at the center of the world, but each is treated as a free subject who is not to be appropriated, but to be loved as another subject who has freedom. To reach communion, both the self and the other must maintain a stance of active receptivity towards the other. That is, both parties must give themselves and receive of the other if full communion is to be achieved. For Sartre, however, both this gift of self and the reception of the other is a figment of the imagination. He writes, "To give a gift is to appropriate by means of destroying, and to use this act of destruction as a means of enslaving others. When we give our possessions or of ourselves, we are giving to enslave the other. We give our property or a person so that we may triumph over the other." Anybody less capable than Sartre of understanding the significance of receiving or the nature of the gift cannot be conceived. Of course, in extreme and unusual instances, some of us have witnessed times when gifts were given to enslave the other, but this is certainly a corrupted form of giving. This is not the robust or even the general notion of it. The kind of gift that I want to focus on here is the fullest kind of gift, the gift of self. I give myself to achieve communion with the other. To give myself as a gift means to be available to and at the disposal of the other. Availability for Marcel is an attitude that is characterized by openness and receptivity. When available, we welcome the other to present themselves, or to presence themselves, to come into their full person, to be who they truly are, nothing more and nothing less. They are welcome to drop their guard, to be at home with us, as we share concerns, worries, and joys with one another. The clearest metaphor for this is when we welcome someone into our home. They are invited to share our possessions and our joy as they enter our place of intimacy. We do not have to own property, however, to be available to the other person. All that is required of us is that we give the other person access to the home of our interior life, that we welcome the other into the intimacy of our heart and mind. In order to be receptive, in order to welcome the other into our home, we must be at home with ourselves. Otherwise, we have no place for the other to enter. We are closed off to the other and are unable to give rest to the other. The person who is self-absorbed, self-obsessed, the person who is always busy and preoccupied, the person who is scattered and disordered will find difficulty in being available to others, They are unable to allow others to enter their interior life. They are therefore unable to invite others to present themselves. Before I said that to give of ourselves is not only to be available to the other, but also to be at the disposal of the other. This may set off an alarm. For start, we place ourselves at the other's disposal so that we may win them over. We become an object of fascination so that we may entice and therefore enslave them. Thus, for start, to place ourselves at the disposal of the other is to become like a disposable diaper. We become dispensable. But this is not what Marcel has in mind. Disposability for Marcel means opening an unlimited credit account in the other's name. We remain available to the other when he or she fails to reciprocate our love, and or even when the other betrays our trust. But this is not mere self-abnegation or hostility towards the self. It is not becoming a doormat to the other. Rather, it is hope. When I am at the other's disposal, I place myself in the position of someone who is asking for a grace, a gift. I'm awaiting a favor of generosity, which I hope will be extended to me. I place myself at the disposal of this generosity, and I have confidence that I will not be disappointed. Nevertheless, full communion is not achieved unless both parties are available and at the disposal of each other. Though I may be at the disposal of those whom I love, I do not reach full communion with them unless they are also available and at the disposal of me. Therefore, I can extend myself towards the other, giving myself as a gift for them, without ever reaching full communion with them. And yet I extend myself with the hope that we will someday achieve communion. For start, this gift of self came with strings attached. It came with an expectation, a demand even, for reciprocity. For Marcel, on the other hand, this love comes with no strings attached. It is instead fueled by a hope, a mighty hope, that you and me will one day achieve communion in full reciprocal relationship of giving and receiving. We extend ourselves so that we may receive the other, and we receive the other so that we may give ourselves.
Because we started a little late, we're going to go ahead and we are going to take a few questions actually. We will end promptly at 10:15. We'll understand if you have to step out before then. If you do have a question, I ask you to step up to this microphone. The first person will have to turn it on, I believe, and go ahead and speak clearly into the microphone. I'm going to go ahead and get started while anyone who has a question steps to the microphone. I just want to note that it does seem that, to me at least, that Edith Stein was an example of the unconditional love that Marcel seems to be describing, and that. But what I'm interested to ask is, between the two panelists here on the stage, what would Marcel have to say about Mr. Bradley's distinction between erotic love and sexual love? How does unconditional love map onto that? And then Mr. Bradley, in turn, if you would respond to why? I mean, is there any connection you see between Sartre's attempt to deny unconditional love and a similar rejection of the incompleteness aspect of erotic love that we're speaking about? So, Mr. Elliot, if you would begin.
So I'll start just by contrasting with what Sartre would say, and then I'll go with what Marcel would say. So Sartre would say that we are actually made as individuals, and that any relationship that we have is an imposition on our freedom. Any friendship that I have with you, any marriage, whatever it may be, it's going to be limiting my own freedom in one sense. For Marcel, on the other hand, we come into our full being when we are in communion with the other. So a quick example of this, if you have a good friend, someone that you could always just talk to, someone that is so easy to talk to, you don't have to push yourself to be someone different, you don't have to try to impress them, you just be yourself and kind of vent freely to this person. You might realize that you're more yourself when you're with this person than when you're by yourself in the room eating Doritos, watching romantic comedies. You come into your full being when you're with this other person. Now, for Marcel, we have desire to reach that. Just because that's who we are, we have desire to come into communion with other people. Now, from what I've read of Marcel, he doesn't speak too explicitly of erotic love. He does speak of marriage, and he thinks that marriage is the most robust form of the relationship with others, the place where we can come into our full being and be who we truly are. And without that kind of relationship, we are also a little bit limited.
And the question was about the relationship between marriage and...
I just want to ask you to speak to whether you see a connection between Sartre's rejection of the possibility of unconditional love and a similar rejection of, I mean, would you think that he would reject, is his conception of erotic love fundamentally flawed by his rejection of unconditional love? Or do you just see no connection?
I think they're both occasioned by his rejection of the idea of goodness of essence. I mean, he's an existentialist. He doesn't really have any concept of essence itself, right, that precedes sort of one's actualizing actions. But he doesn't believe, he fundamentally doesn't believe that creation itself is good. And so there's nothing to affirm. And so not only can there not be unconditional love, but as you heard very gloomily, there can't be any love, which isn't surprising for him. So I feel bad for whoever he married, if he was married.
Turn this on?
Yes, please.
And that on switch would be somewhere within my reach.
Also identify yourself.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, Michael, because I felt compelled to get up and say something because Tina just a couple of minutes ago was putting a question to Mr. Bradley. Now, for most people, I'm Mr. Bradley, and the person in between Rob and Tiernan is Mikey. But I realized shortly after I started moving towards the microphone that Tiernan was actually addressing the young man to his left. But the other reason I felt obliged to get up and say something was I'm trying to think of a good question, thinking that perhaps Mike and Rob both would need some help from a more seasoned elder. And I realize that they don't, actually, so I have a genuine question for both of them. And I think my question is mainly for the two people who are present. And it is this, that in light of really two, I think, very fine and enlightening talks, I wonder if you could just change your vantage point just a little bit, both of you, and consider from your experience as young 20-somethings in a college environment, if you could identify what you think to be the leading or most formidable impediment to your fellows' enjoyment, if you will, of the insights that you've offered. I'm sure there are many things, distractions, multitasking, but if you could think of the thing, the habit, practice, or belief that you think is the biggest impediment to a greater appreciation, development, and appropriation, personal appropriation of what you've been saying. Again, looking at your peers, and not wondering about Michael's younger sister, for example. Anna, who's right here.
Yeah, so I was hoping to get to this, but I was not a good steward of my time. The easy answer is that we've collapsed erotic desire to sexual desire. And so now the great cultural lie that's confusing and ensnaring so many people, so many of my peers, is that they do have these erotic desires that can't be fulfilled by any sort of sexual union or any sort of personal relationship, but they're told that whatever desires they do have will be fulfilled by a sexual relationship. And this is what breeds the inevitable disenchantment, disenfranchisement, confusion, sense of emptiness and hollowness that people feel on Saturday mornings. Without question, this is what it is. And this also is related to the losing of the sight of the doctrine of creation. You sort of conceive of the person, any desires I have must be satisfiable by things that are here, by things that I can touch. That's sort of the idea. And when you start to think that way and you've lost the real object and the source of the same desires, the fulfillment of which really make you happy and fulfilled, then you're sort of in trouble. C.S. Lewis said famously, I find that I have desires that can't be met by this world, so I conclude that I was meant for another world. And that's very true, but that's not sort of what you're being fed through the media, and that's something that my peers are struggling with.
So I could talk about kind of the results of what I think the deeper issue is. So like the results might be you try to have a conversation with someone, they're always texting, they're always on Facebook, or they're always getting distracted. They're doing something else, they're preoccupied, they're not thinking about what's immediately in front of them. But I think that's more of a result of something that's a little bit deeper than the issue itself, right? I think that's a problem. I think those habits definitely form problems. I think the deeper issue is along the lines of what Mike was saying, seeing the goodness in creation itself, seeing the goodness in things themselves, seeing the goodness in persons for who they are. So G.K. Chesterton has this great line in the Ethics of Elkhorn, in his book Orthodoxy, where he's talking about God as a young child, right? And God, you know how a young child can continuously say, do it again, do it again. It's always delighted by something that seems so mundane, something that's just like so obvious, we've done it, it's like tedious to us now. But for the child, their eyes light up, they're delighted in it. G.K. Chesterton says, what if God is like that? What if every morning when the sun rises, God is like, do it again, do it again, do it again. And it's continuously upholding us in our existence, delighting in us. And then we kind of like reciprocate that delight. And we realize that there is goodness in all things. There is goodness in all people. And it takes a little bit of work to find that. You're not going to find that in text messaging. You're going to find that in close interactions with others, in close interactions in the world. Not being preoccupied or not being like abstracted from yourself, but being there, being present.
On that note, I think we are going to go ahead and close the session. I'm sure that our panelists will be happy to stick around and answer any particular questions you have. The next session will not begin for at least 15 minutes. Please join me in thanking both of our